Over Berlin, March 1944, the sky burns silver. At 20,000 feet, a swarm of P-51 Mustangs cuts through the frozen clouds. Sleek, fast, untouchable. Below them, Berlin lies shrouded in smoke and fear. The black bursts of flak bloom across the horizon, but the Mustangs keep flying, steady and relentless. Inside one of them, a pilot glances at his gauges. The needle holds firm. His engine hums, smooth, powerful, perfect. That sound, that symphony of speed and precision, wasn't born on the battlefield. It was born in the quiet mind of an engineer who once built toys out of scrap metal in a German village. His name was Edgar Schmood, and though he never fired a shot, his creation would change the fate of the air war over Europe forever. By late 1942, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard. Every daylight bombing raid into Germany ended the same way. Black smoke, falling wings, and silent parachutes descending over enemy fields. The U.S. 8th Air Force, newly arrived in Britain, believed daylight precision bombing could cripple Hitler's war machine. But there was a fatal flaw in that dream. Their heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, could fly far. Their escorts could not. Beyond the Rhine, every mile closer to Berlin was a death sentence. The RAF had already learned this the hard way in 1941, switching to night bombing after catastrophic losses. Yet, the Americans persisted, flying by day through flak and fighters, determined to prove their strategy right. By mid-1943, that determination turned into disaster. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, tore into the bomber streams with impunity. They attacked from above, dove through the formations, and vanished before any Allied fighter could intercept. The result was slaughter. On missions like Schweinfurt-Regensburg, entire bomber groups vanished. Out of 376 aircraft that left England, 60 never returned. Hundreds of airmen, young men barely in their 20s, were lost in a single afternoon. The phrase "thousand-mile coffin" began circulating among crews. Commanders understood the problem clearly. The bombers needed a guardian that could fly all the way to Berlin and back. But in 1943, such a plane didn't exist. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were formidable at medium range, but they simply couldn't stretch across Europe without fuel tanks the size of bathtubs. Pilots often had to turn back near the German border, leaving the bombers exposed during the most dangerous part of the mission. The Luftwaffe knew this window perfectly and used it. They waited for the escorts to peel off, then struck like hawks. Every raid into Germany became a predictable ambush. The Allies' technological and industrial advantage meant nothing if their planes couldn't reach the target. The balance of air power hung on a single unsolved equation: speed, altitude, and range. And in the middle of this crisis, an unusual proposal appeared on a desk at the British Air Purchasing Commission in 1940, long before the Americans realized how badly they'd need it. It came from North American Aviation, a relatively new company led by Dutch Kindleberger, an engineer turned industrial commander, and his chief designer, Edgar Schmood. The British had asked North American to build P-40 fighters under license. Schmood offered something else. "Give us 120 days, he said, "and we'll build you something better." It was a bold promise, almost reckless. But out of that promise would come the machine that would rewrite the air war. Edgar Schmood wasn't a general nor a pilot. He was a craftsman, quiet, meticulous, and obsessed with the poetry of flight. Born in 1899 in Hornbach, Germany, he grew up fascinated by engines and motion. His first designs weren't aircraft. They were toys, whittled from wood and powered by imagination. After World War I, Schmood trained as an engineer, working in Germany and later for Fokker in the Netherlands. But in 1930, he left Europe behind, emigrating to the United States in search of freedom and opportunity. There, at North American Aviation in California, he found his calling. Schmood believed that beauty and function were inseparable, that a perfectly engineered plane should look fast even when standing still. When Britain came asking for new fighters in 1940, he finally had his chance to prove it. The clock was merciless, 120 days to design and build a prototype. Most engineers would have said it was impossible. Schmood didn't argue. He simply began to draw. He envisioned a fighter that could outclimb, outdive, and outlast anything in the sky. Every curve, every rivet, every air intake served one purpose: efficiency. His secret weapon was the laminar flow wing, a new aerodynamic concept that reduced drag dramatically. It was a design so clean that, on paper, it promised both speed and endurance, two traits rarely found together in 1940. By October, the first prototype was ready, the NA-73X. When it took off for the first time, it stunned test pilots. The plane handled like silk, fast, agile, and responsive. The British ordered hundreds, naming it the Mustang. But there was a problem. While the airframe was revolutionary, its engine wasn't. The Allison V1710, standard in early Mustangs, performed well at low altitudes, ideal for ground attack, but gasped for air above 15,000 feet. In the European Air War, altitude was everything. The Luftwaffe ruled the high sky. As 1942 turned into 1943, the Mustang seemed destined to remain a limited tool, fast but earthbound. The Allies needed high-altitude power, not low-level speed. That's when the British made a bold suggestion. Fit the Mustang with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that powered the Spitfire. It was a transatlantic marriage of brilliance, American design meeting British horsepower. North American engineers worked furiously to adapt the Mustang's sleek frame to the new engine. The result, the P-51B, was something no one had ever seen before. It climbed higher, flew farther, and struck faster than any Allied fighter in existence. The transformation was nothing short of alchemy. With drop tanks added, the Mustang could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back again. The once vulnerable airmen of the 8th Air Force finally had their guardian angel. When the first Merlin-powered Mustangs took flight in late 1943, the war in the air began to tilt. Pilots spoke of it with awe. A fighter that could turn inside a Messerschmitt, chase down an FW-190, and still glide home on fumes. Behind every rivet was Schmood's hand. Behind every roar was the hum of his obsession made real. And soon, the skies above Germany would echo with that sound, the sound of a machine that turned survival into supremacy. 1. The human angle. The immigrant who built a legend, Edgar Schmood, lived in contradictions. He was German by birth, but his masterpiece would help destroy Nazi Germany. He fled a world consumed by nationalism, only to watch his own invention become one of the sharpest weapons in that same war. Those who worked with him described a man of quiet precision. He spoke little, but his hands never stopped sketching. Wings, fuselages, ideas. He believed airplanes had souls, that the right design could almost breathe. And though he never wore a uniform, Schmood served in his own way, not through rank or command, but through pure creation. In war, most men fought with courage. He fought with mathematics, airflow, and vision. And in doing so, he gave the Allies something no strategy or speech ever could: control of the skies. The technological angle, the art of speed and every aircraft, begins as a compromise between speed, lift, and endurance. But Schmood refused to compromise. He wanted all three, and he found a way. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was the first of its kind used in combat. Traditional wings created turbulence, microscopic storms that slowed flight and burned fuel. Schmood's design kept the air smooth and attached longer, slicing through the sky like a blade through silk. It wasn't magic. It was physics refined to perfection. The fuselage was sculpted around that principle. Long, slender, and elegant. The radiator scoop beneath the body wasn't just cooling. It generated thrust through the Meredith effect, turning wasted heat into forward speed. Even its canopy, its landing gear, its armament, everything served the logic of aerodynamics. The result was a fighter that could fly faster and farther on less power, with the grace of a bird and the sting of a hornet. When the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was added, that harmony became symphony. At 30,000 feet, where the air thins and engines gasp, the Mustang soared effortlessly. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers deep into the heart of Nazi territory and still fight their way home. The leadership angle, the gamble that paid off. At North American Aviation, leadership meant risk. Dutch Kindelberger, the company's president, was as bold as Schmood was meticulous. When the British first approached him in 1940 to license-produce Curtiss P-40s, he made a dangerous decision. Instead of building someone else's plane, he promised to build a new one, from scratch, in record time. It was an industrial gamble that could have destroyed his company. But Kindelberger trusted Schmood's vision completely. He gave him freedom, resources, and faith, the rarest currency in wartime industry. Together, they broke the rules of production. The Mustang went from blueprint to flight in 117 days, an engineering sprint unmatched even today. No committee delays, no bureaucratic filters, just clear purpose and speed. In an era when nations fought with mass and numbers, the Mustang was proof that elegance could be a weapon too. And as its silhouette began to dominate Allied airfields, few realized that the machine standing before them was born not in the war rooms of Washington, but in the imagination of an immigrant engineer and the courage of one company's leaders. From these human, technological, and leadership angles, one truth emerges. The P-51 Mustang wasn't an accident of war. It was a triumph of willpower and intellect in the face of impossible odds. And as the Mustang began to appear in greater numbers over Europe, its legend took on new dimensions in the minds of enemies, in the hearts of pilots, and in the moral weight of invention itself. The enemy angle, the fear in German skies. By early 1944, the hunters had become the hunted. German fighter pilots, once the undisputed lords of the air, began to see silver shadows far above them. Sleek aircraft with the speed and range to appear from nowhere. At first, the Luftwaffe couldn't believe what they were facing. Reports described a new American type, faster than a 190, diving steeper than a 109, and somehow still circling at high altitude without losing speed. It could escort bombers from England all the way to Berlin, a distance the Germans once thought unreachable. When the first Mustangs appeared over the Reich, the shock was total. The Luftwaffe's traditional tactic, waiting for escorts to turn back, no longer worked. Now, Mustangs stayed with the bombers to the target, chased the German fighters home, and often strafed their airfields before returning to base. Within months, German aces began to fall, not for lack of skill, but for lack of air left to fight in. They called it der Schrecken mit dem langen Atem, the terror with long breath. The moral angle, the genius, and the guilt war thrives on invention. Every breakthrough that saves one life can end another. And for engineers like Edgar Schmood, that paradox was impossible to ignore. He never spoke publicly about what it felt like to see his creation turned into a weapon. To him, the Mustang was an expression of perfection, balance, power, and grace. But perfection in war is never innocent. Each advance in design meant fewer German planes returning home, more smoke rising from burning fields, more names crossed from rosters. Still, Schmood believed in the necessity of his work. He once said that aircraft design was a race against death, and in 1944, that race meant saving the lives of Allied airmen who once flew into Germany without hope of return. For every bomber that reached its target and came home, for every pilot who landed safely, there was the unseen hand of an engineer who had given them a fighting chance. And perhaps that was enough to quiet the guilt, at least for a while. The tactical angle, the revolution of reach before the Mustang, the U.S. Air Force fought two separate wars, bombers by day, fighters by distance. With the P-51, those wars merged into one. The Mustang's long range, nearly 1,600 miles with drop tanks, made it the first fighter capable of true strategic escort. It could accompany bombers from takeoff to target, fight over the heart of Germany, and still return home without refueling. That changed everything. For the first time, bomber formations could strike critical industrial centers, Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, without being torn apart. The Luftwaffe, forced into constant defensive action, began to collapse under exhaustion. Mustang pilots didn't just guard bombers. They hunted enemy fighters. They swept ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the skies before the slow-moving giants arrived. It was a brutal, methodical dismantling of German air power, one sortie at a time. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe commanders were reporting crippling losses and fuel shortages. German factories could still produce aircraft, but they couldn't produce trained pilots fast enough to replace the fallen. Every day, fewer and fewer Messerschmitts rose to meet the intruders. The Mustang had done what strategy and bombing alone could not. It strangled the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. The air war had changed, and at its center stood one machine and one man, whose creation had tilted the balance of the entire conflict. Soon, that transformation would reach its most dramatic test, when the first waves of Merlin-powered Mustangs roared toward Berlin itself. Winter, 1943. Over the fields of Cambridgeshire, England, the air vibrates with a new sound, a deep, confident hum that pilots had never heard before. It isn't the steady rumble of the thunderbolt or the twin growl of the lightning. It's sharper, cleaner, almost musical. The first P-51B Mustangs, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, are ready for combat. And the men who will fly them, the long-suffering escort pilots of the 8th Air Force, can feel it instantly. On December 1, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group takes their Mustangs into the skies. Their mission? Escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The target? Industrial complexes along the Ruhr. The result? Transformation. Where other fighters struggled for altitude, the Mustang climbs effortlessly. Where others burned fuel too fast, the Mustang stretches the horizon. By the time they cross into Germany, the pilots realize something extraordinary. They're still with the bombers, still in formation, still ready to fight. German radar picks up the incoming raid. As Luftwaffe squadrons scramble to intercept, they expect the usual pattern. Escorts turning back near the frontier, leaving the bombers exposed. But when they reach the formation, the escorts are still there. Mustangs, dozens of them, waiting, weaving, patient as predators. The first dogfights are short, brutal, and decisive. Messerschmitts dive into the bomber stream and find Mustangs diving after them. The Merlin engine howls, the laminar flow wings slice, and suddenly the Luftwaffe's advantage in speed and climb evaporates. For the first time, German pilots face an American fighter that can match them at every altitude and outrun them home. One Luftwaffe veteran years later described it simply, "They came from nowhere. We could no longer escape. The sky belonged to them." By January 1944, the 8th Air Force begins full-scale escort operations with the P-51. The impact is immediate and devastating. Bomber losses drop. German fighter losses rise. Within weeks, Allied air commanders realize they now possess what they had prayed for since 1942, a fighter that could go the distance and win. Edgar Schmood, back in California, receives word of the Mustang's performance from test reports and combat logs. He never went to the front. He never saw Berlin. But in every photograph of a smiling pilot beside his Mustang, there was a quiet reflection of his work. The Mustang had done the impossible. It had turned survival into strategy and defense into dominance. By spring 1944, the Mustang had become the backbone of the Allied escort force. From the 4th to the 357th Fighter Group, the call signs Blue Leader and Red Flight echoed across the English countryside. These were the men who would ride the silver-winged stallions to the gates of Berlin itself. And as they prepared for those missions, the Luftwaffe braced for something it had never faced before, a relentless enemy that could reach them anywhere, anytime, without mercy or fatigue. From that winter forward, every roar of a Merlin engine over Europe marked the sound of a turning tide. But the true test of Schmoed's creation and of the air war's destiny would come next, the great raids over Berlin. March 4th, 1944. For the first time, American bombers are ordered to strike Berlin in daylight. It's not just a mission, it's a statement. The command knows the risks. The Luftwaffe will throw everything it has left into the sky. But this time, the bombers aren't alone. Escorting them are hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, sleek, silver, and fearless. As dawn breaks over East Anglia, engines roar in unison. Crews climb aboard. One pilot scribbles a note before takeoff. "If we reach Berlin and back, the war will never be the same." At 25,000 feet, the bomber formations stretch like steel rivers across the sky. Above them, the Mustangs weave, tight, disciplined, invisible guardians. The German radar stations detect the incoming armada. Sirens scream across airfields from Hanover to Brandenburg. Luftwaffe squadrons scramble. FW-190s, Bf-109s, even the aging Me-110s. But the sky that once belonged to them is no longer theirs. The first attacks come in waves. Messerschmitts dive head-on into the bomber stream, the old tactic. But before they reach the B-17s, Mustangs fall upon them from higher altitude, cutting across their paths with precision fire. The air becomes chaos. White contrails twisting in deadly spirals. Tracer rounds stitching the clouds. The Merlin engines scream, the guns chatter, and in moments, the hunter becomes the hunted. Pilots later described it as a ballet of death above the capital. The Luftwaffe fought with desperation, but they were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outflown. For the first time in the war, Allied fighters were fighting, and winning, over Berlin itself. On the ground below, German civilians looked up and saw the contrails, the endless white scars across the sky. The myth of air superiority was crumbling in front of their eyes. By the end of that mission, dozens of German fighters lay scattered across fields and forests. The bombers returned, battered but intact. The impossible had been done. Berlin had been struck in daylight, and the bombers had come home. From that moment, the Luftwaffe's decline became irreversible. Its veteran pilots were gone. Its fuel reserves dwindled. Training programs collapsed. Every time new replacements took to the air, the Mustangs were waiting. By April, the Mustangs were no longer just escorts. They were predators. They hunted German fighters on the ground, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft before they could even take off. The strategy was ruthless but effective. Within months, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a serious threat. General James Doolittle, now commanding the 8th Air Force, put it plainly. "We are going to fight for air supremacy, and we're going to win it with the Mustang." And they did. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the skies above Normandy were cleared by the very aircraft that had once been a gamble on a designer's sketchpad. The P-51 was everywhere, escorting, scouting, strafing, a silver flash in every corner of Europe's sky. Behind its beauty was the invisible triumph of Edgar Schmood's design, the engineer's gift to every pilot who dared cross enemy lines. The Mustang had achieved what no other fighter had before it. It didn't just survive the air war over Germany, it ended it. And with that, the age of Luftwaffe dominance was over. From that spring onward, the sky belonged to the Allies. When the smoke cleared over Europe, the numbers told the story that words could not. By the summer of 1944, Allied bombers were reaching their targets across the Reich with survival rates unthinkable just a year earlier. The 8th Air Force, once crippled by losses, now pressed its advantage relentlessly. German industrial centers, once protected by altitude and distance, were now exposed, day after day, to relentless bombardment. In early 1944, average bomber losses had stood at nearly 9% per mission. By late 1944, under Mustang escort, that figure dropped to below 2%. Each percentage point meant hundreds of airmen alive. Each mission a victory, not just of machines, but of minds. The Mustang didn't just protect, it conquered. By the end of the war, P-51 pilots claimed more than 4,900 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, and thousands more on the ground. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons were erased in weeks. In the span of months, German skies went from fortress to graveyard. But beyond the numbers lay something deeper, a shift in the psychology of the war. For the first time, Allied crews flew into enemy airspace without the shadow of dread that had haunted earlier missions. They had a guardian now. When the radio crackled with little friends overhead, every bomber crew knew their odds of seeing home again had doubled. In those months, the Mustang became more than a fighter. It became a symbol, proof that technology, courage, and intellect could overcome even the fiercest odds. Back in Inglewood, California, Edgar Schmood followed the reports with quiet pride. He rarely spoke of glory. He spoke of design. In one interview after the war, he said simply, "The Mustang was built to fly, not to fight." But war demanded both. His creation had not just changed the air war, it had changed the tempo of Allied victory. With German skies cleared, supply lines opened, bombing campaigns intensified, and the invasion of Europe became possible. By D-Day, Allied forces could land on Normandy's beaches under skies swept clean of German fighters, a condition that would have been unthinkable without Schmood's machine. The road to Berlin on the ground began with victory in the air, and the P-51 untold Mustang, born from a 120-day promise and an engineer's dream, had made that victory possible. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of P-51 Mustangs stood lined across the airfields of Europe, wings gleaming in the pale sunlight of victory. For the men who had flown them, these machines were more than tools of war. They were trusted companions, the steel wings that carried them home again and again. But peace brought new questions. What does one do with perfection built for destruction? Many Mustangs were scrapped, Their aluminum melted down for peacetime use. Others found new lives, racing through the skies at Reno, serving in small air forces from Sweden to Israel, from South Africa to South Korea. The P-51's design was so advanced, so balanced, that it remained operational for nearly 3 decades, long after jets had replaced most propeller-driven fighters. When war returned to the Korean Peninsula in 1950, the Mustang flew again. Though outclassed by early jets in raw speed, it proved invaluable in ground attack missions, strafing convoys and trains with deadly precision. Even in the age of jet engines, pilots trusted its agility and toughness. The Mustang had outlived the war it was born for, and adapted to one it was never meant to fight. As the 1950s advanced, Schmued moved on to new challenges. He joined North American Aviation's jet programs, and later Northrop, where he helped shape the F-86 Sabre and the F-5 Freedom Fighter. Sleek, fast, and efficient, carrying the same aerodynamic philosophy that had made the Mustang legendary. Quietly, his fingerprints were on an entire generation of aircraft that would define the Cold War skies. Yet, he never sought fame. He preferred the company of blueprints, not headlines. When asked late in life what the P-51 meant to him, he said, "It was never about the machine. It was about giving the pilot a fair chance." That humility defined his legacy. In museums and hangars across the world today, restored Mustangs still take to the air. Engines growling, wings slicing through sunlight, a living echo of 1944. Each flight is a tribute to the man who believed that engineering could be both beautiful and moral, both precise and humane. The P-51 was more than an aircraft. It was a statement that brilliance, when guided by necessity and courage, can turn the tide of history. And as long as one Mustang flies, the spirit of Edgar Schmued, the quiet engineer who helped free Europe from the air, will never truly fade. History often remembers the warriors, the aces, the generals, the heroes who faced death in open skies. But sometimes, history is moved just as deeply by the quiet minds behind the machines. Edgar Schmued never fired a gun in anger, never stood in a cockpit above Berlin. Yet his creation gave others the power to survive, to prevail, and to return home. He embodied a truth the war had revealed again and again, that genius in a workshop can be as decisive as courage in battle. The P-51 Mustang was not born of luck, nor of chance. It was born of obsession. Every curve, every bolt, every line serving a single purpose: endurance. In its simplicity lay perfection, and in its performance, freedom itself found wings. Long after the engines fell silent, the sound of a Merlin echoing through the sky still carries something sacred, a reminder of the moment when design met destiny. Schmued's story is a quiet one, but within that silence lies the heartbeat of modern aviation, the proof that brilliance, guided by purpose, can alter the course of nations. The P-51 did more than win a war. It defined what it means to build something worthy of the people who fly it. And that, more than speed, more than power, is what made it unstoppable.